Hello and welcome to People and Profit. I'm Solange Mougin. In today's show, we're focusing on global poverty and how crises from the COVID pandemic to the war in Ukraine have turned back years of progress. We'll also find out what can be done to save future generations. The World Bank estimates that 70 million more people were forced into extreme poverty in 2020. This means a total of 719 people have been living under the international poverty line, which is living with less than $2.15 a day. The poverty line increases slightly depending on a nation's development status. But nonetheless, we're talking about hundreds of millions who are struggling to survive. My guest today is Mari Pangestu. She is the Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank. She is also a former trade minister for Indonesia. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to ask you first if you can tell us about the World Bank's findings and why the fight against poverty has ground to a halt.
Hello, Solange. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
You mentioned the 70 million below the extreme poverty line, and because of the pandemic in 2020. Basically, what has happened is, after the 2008 financial crisis, growth had slowed down. So poverty reduction had slowed down, and then you had the pandemic, which was a big shock, leading to the increase in the number of people entering extreme poverty to 70 million. And we expect in 2022 there's still going to be another shock because of all the multiple crises we're still facing. And I think the other dimensions of these findings is that there has also been increased inequality between countries because the more developed and higher middle income countries were able to rebound faster with higher fiscal stimulus, the ability to vaccinate, and come back more quickly. And the lower income countries could not have that rebound. So there's a sharpening of growth and therefore poverty reduction between countries. So there's the inequality. And within countries, because everybody's income fell, but the incomes of the bottom 40% fell by double or 4% compared to the top 20%, which fell on average by 2%. So we are also experiencing increase in inequality. And I think the final dimension I would add is that the extreme poverty is concentrated in various regions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Oh, and I had another point to make also, that besides the extreme poverty, we saw an increase in the middle income level poverty of $6.85. It went from something like 46% to 47%. So half of the world's population are below the $6.85 line. So it is also a middle income country issue.
I'd like to ask you about education. It was disrupted around the world during the pandemic. How does that affect a child's potential and an economy's potential as well?
Yes, thank you for that question, because I do think we need to, while the poverty and inequality numbers look very, very sobering, I think we need to focus on, okay, what do we need to do to address it? And one of the issues is the learning losses that happened during the pandemic, which will have the potential for, if it's not addressed urgently, it will reduce productivity and growth and increase inequality. So what has happened is actually learning poverty, which is measured by the ability of a 10-year-old child to read and understand simple text, went up from 55% to 70% due to COVID, because of this average. I think it's like 140 days when schools were closed, and in some countries it was 2 years. So this is going to affect. It's going to have a lost generation of children and young adults, which will then affect your ability to increase labor productivity and growth. And the impact is obviously differentiated between those who were able to do remote learning and those who were able to capture now the learning losses between those who don't. So the gap is going to widen if countries do not prioritize within their response to today's situation, not just the emergency food crisis, but also the longer learning losses crisis.
I'd now like to ask you about climate change. How does it and how will it deepen poverty?
Yes, that's another short-term, long-term driver of increased poverty and development, which we really need to prioritize starting now, because the climate crisis is existential. It's there, it's here already, and already having the impact. Our assessments show that 132 million more people will be entering into extreme poverty by 2030 if we don't do anything in the business as usual scenario. And then you have other metrics, such as 25 million people have actually been displaced, and these are the vulnerable populations due to climate disasters. And in very vulnerable situations like the small island development states, such as the Pacific Islands, they have been losing like 1 to 6% of their GDP due to climate disasters. And this is going to just increase if we do not address climate, and it has to be addressed in integrating climate with development. And this is really one of the priority programs of the World Bank.
So in addition to climate and the pandemic, I'd like to ask you about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has sparked a new food crisis. Where do we stand currently on this?
Yeah, definitely everybody's feeling it. You and I are feeling it, and the people in the low-income countries are absolutely feeling it. You know, we have seen a spike in food prices, but rising food prices had preceded the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine, but the invasion accentuated, if you like, the food price increase and energy price increase. And they're related, because energy prices leads to higher fertilizer prices and therefore higher food prices. So
what measures can we take?
The measures that we can take is, first and foremost, is to safeguard the vulnerable and poor parts of your population from the food price increases. And this is about subsidized targeted programs. And second, we need to minimize, if not eliminate, the export restrictions that are happening, which are accentuating the high food price increases. There are export bans and limitations of exports of food undertaken by many countries, and it fell and then it's increased again. And third, we must focus on the long-term drivers of food insecurity. We had a food crisis in 2008. How do we address the longer-term sustainable food production and address the drivers of food insecurity? Part of it is climate, part of it is sustainable food production, and all the way across the supply chain, and minimize and make sure that trade in food and fertilizers will flow.
I'd also like to ask you about China. Xi Jinping says that he claims to have wiped out extreme poverty. Does the World Bank see proof of that, or are the standards of measuring poverty different here?
It's certainly been proven. We have seen China's reduction in extreme poverty of 800 million in the last 40 years. And this has been because of rapid and sustained growth, as well as broad-based transformation of the economy. But China, as other middle-income countries, by the way, large middle-income countries have also experienced large reductions in extreme poverty because of a sustained high growth path and development path. But moving forward, you remember I mentioned the high level of middle-income countries having the higher level of poverty that middle-income countries will still face. So addressing that will still be an issue for all middle-income countries, including China. And I think moving forward, climate change will also impact on growth, on productivity of all countries, including the middle-income countries. So going on a low carbon resilient growth path will also be important to address moving forward, addressing the higher levels of poverty as well as productivity that will be affecting these countries.
Finally, how can the international community get back to reducing poverty and in a sustainable way? In a long-term way?
Very good question. I think in a long-term way. So I think I would say I would give you 3 points to answer your question. First point is that the immediate situation is very dire. You've got slow growth, you've got high inflation, high interest rates, tightening financial conditions, capital outflows, depreciation. This is the situation faced by many countries, including the developing countries. So first and foremost, protect the poor and vulnerable, with targeted subsidy programs and adaptable social protection, because you want to not have an increase in poverty or inequality in the short term. Second, you should focus on making sure that you try to recover, try to have a growth policy, and that's about managing the macro risks as well as the structural reforms that you need for growth. And third point, related to the learning losses we talked about earlier, we need to address, beginning today, some of the urgent longer-term drivers that will lead to poverty increasing and inequality increasing, which is the human capital losses, especially learning losses, and the climate crisis, which will impact and have impact on human capital, on growth, on the ability of countries to be more resilient to the climate shocks.
Thank you, Mari Pangestu of the World Bank, for speaking with People in Profit. That's all we have time for now. Don't forget, you can find this and our previous shows on France 24's website or as a podcast, wherever you usually listen. Until next time, thanks for watching.
With all the main European news, debates between representatives of the best and worst performing EU member states, and exclusive interviews with major personalities.
Talking Europe, presented by Catherine Nicholson on France 24 and France24.com.